We must now move to the next debate on the order paper. Mr. David Amess.
Mr. Bone, I make this speech in sorrow and anger. I make the speech in sorrow because as a result of the failings of SEPT, my constituents are suffering, and I make it in anger because as a parliamentarian who takes his job extremely seriously, I have simply not been listened to. And it was in this very place on the 1st of March 2001, 13 years ago, that I made a speech outlining in graphic terms how absolutely disgraceful it was in terms of the way the mental health services were run in the area that was looking after people in Southend with problems. And I should say immediately that I see no purpose in an adjournment debate if members of Parliament raise issues and then ministers say, well, they're very glad that the issue has been raised, and then it all gathers dust. Let me make it perfectly clear, Mr. Bone, I am not going to remain silent on this issue until something is done. And the minister, who is a Liberal, will understand very well that Liberals like to dig themselves into their constituencies and have a high profile. That is what I did in Basildon, and that is what I've done in Southend West. So I know my area better than the minister, better than CQC, better than Monitor, better than the civil servants, and far better than the trustees and directors of SEPT. I really do know what the service is like. And I will be presenting the case to the House that the organisation, and they will be horrified when they have their private meeting and read what I'm going to say about them and how it's going to be reported. But as far as I'm concerned, let me use New Labour terms. The organisation is not fit for purpose. And then let me use terms that the minister might respond to. There are lessons to be learnt. And then we have governance. Well, I can remember only too clearly, Mr. Bone, the then Labour minister, listening to what I was sharing with the House. Absolutely nothing was done about it, and they suffered. Because under the Labour Party, under the Labour government of 13 years, this organisation did extremely well under their previous chief executive. And I will outline all sorts of honours that he received. He did extremely well. And thinking about my old constituency of Basildon, when Sir John Major visited Basildon Hospital, it was a first-class hospital. Very, very proud that. That's where all my 5 children were born. That's where we use local health services. I don't have private health care. I use the National Health Service. When the last Labour Prime Minister visited it, Basildon, just before the election, on a public relations exercise, and the media reported how marvellous everything was, it's only been over the last 3 years, as the minister knows, an inspection was done at the hospital, and it breaks my heart what went on with that fabulous hospital. Fortunately, there's new management in there, and it's being turned round in a remarkable fashion, and it's got the finest cardiac unit, perhaps, in the country. So I can't speak highly enough of Basildon Hospital now. But I'm only sharing this with the House because public relations exercise can mislead in a graphic way. Now, what am I after in this debate so that we don't lose sight of what's happening? I think it's totally wrong that the previous chief executive, on his huge salary and all the personal things which went on with the trust that we, the residents, have been paying for, I think it's absolutely outrageous that the governing body, whose duty is for governance of the organisation, then appoints the deputy, who's been with the organisation since 2005. The thing that is so wrong about this organisation is the management. And that is why they're not going to like what I'm going to say. But it's absolutely disgraceful. Now, since I've been a Member of Parliament, I've observed how little power ministers have these days. Because it was under Tony Blair's government that gradually powers seeped away. So I absolutely accept the minister is limited in what he can do. But I have to say that having had meetings with Monitor and the Care Quality Commission, my hobby horses, for the life of me, while we've got two organisations, and one of them is in Wellington House, very close to the health service, I do not know. And when I challenged them on these issues and all the complaints, they were completely lost. So it's very, very frustrating. When I first became a Member of Parliament, I could get things done. I saved Basildon A&E with just 2 days to go, and a long, long list of things. Now we pass things to ministers. It may take them 4 weeks, 8 weeks or 12 months for the civil service to produce a letter that is top and tail. And at the end of it all, it's a complete waste of time. I'm not going to have this with this issue because the mental health service is the Cinderella service of the country, as we all know. And I applaud what the government is doing with all their notices on the tube. It's been pointed out to me, and the way that they're trying to turn around in real terms, the way people see others who are suffering from mental health with depression, see it in a better light. But I am not holding my breath that it will be the government who's going to take action here. I think it has to be, frankly, people power. We all know, Mr. Bone, that certainly when I first became a Member of Parliament, I never saw as many people as I do with mental health problems now. They are growing in number, whether it be depression or all sorts of matters. It's definitely increasing in numbers. I really feel for my constituents who have a loved one who has a mental health problem, not just through drug abuse or alcohol abuse, but a real mental health problem. And then you go through the sectioning process, which is not an easy process. And of course it involves the police, and that's another subject as well. But what I want from the mental health service in the area that looks after people in Southend, some honesty. Is it that they can no longer cope, that they don't know what they're doing? But I am sick to death with the endless list of complaints I have from constituents about mental health services. And they are not part of the nanny state wanting to dump their problem onto the state. They are in complete anguish as to what it's like to get someone sectioned. And then, of course, there is the nightmare when they're sectioned. People are told, well, we can't talk to you directly because the person being sectioned has a number of rights. And yet when they're released, it's the families who can often be aged who are having to cope with these very, very difficult circumstances. And sadly, all the figures I say to the minister seems to be that the numbers of people with mental health problems is actually growing. Now, according to figures provided by SEPT, in 2004, there were 184 complaints. There was no record of any of the complaints being upheld. Now, you would have thought somewhere in government would have, when I complained about it, thought, well, how on earth can that happen? In 2012/13, under an enlarged organisation, which of course seems to be an excuse, 434 complaints were made against the service, and of those, 243 were upheld. So over half of the complaints were actually upheld. We don't have the time, Mr. Bone, to go into the details of the stress it caused when you're raising a complaint and the length of time it takes to deal with. But those figures in itself should have sent alarm bells ringing in the Department of Health. But I don't actually think that that has happened. So my question today is, why on earth has this service, which in the early 2000s was already in a shocking state of affair, been allowed to continue in this fashion? Why has no one intervened when I raised it in this chamber in 2001? It just really isn't good enough, frankly, that nothing has been done. And what makes matters worse is that the organisation is rewarded for failure. Now, many of the people in the organisation, of course, because there'll be lines to take on this, weren't there on the journey that I've been on, because after 31 years, I've got a real picture. But I go back to the appointment of the present chairman, who's been with the organisation since 2005. In 2010, 118 employees earned more than £60,000, which was up from 99 in 2009. More recently, in light of the numbers of complaints that I've just quoted, in March 2013, 161 staff earned more than £70,000, 49 of which, 49, earned between £100,000 and £150,000. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. 50 earning between 100 and 150,000. But it gets worse, Mr. Bone. So while complaints to the trust were increasing exponentially, SEPT staff were rewarded with higher salaries than would have been the norm. In 2009, while many ordinary people were suffering from the worst effects of the global recession, the chief executive of SEPT's salary rose from £170,000 to £200,000, and then it became much higher than that. This is absolute madness, and it's all in Hansard. This is supposed to be the mother of Parliament who runs the country. I've complained about this time after time, and yet nothing at all has happened. An absolute disgrace, really, that my words of caution have been ignored about this. The salaries, apparently, were justified to recognise the Trust's exceptional performance. Well, that's a joke, if ever there's a tick-the-box exercise. The constituents and whistleblowers who have contacted me would certainly question that. So, Mr. Bone, following on from my Christmas pre-recess adjournment debate when I raised this issue, I was informed by a government minister that CQC currently has no concerns about SEPT services in Southend. Well, that's a laugh in itself, frankly. No concerns? What on earth have they been doing? Absolutely ridiculous. I do not necessarily dispute whether the inspections of these services were carried out rigorously enough, but what I would dispute is that a recent inspection in September 2013, when I started to again make a fuss about this, found no overarching concerns for any of the 4 essential standards, one of them being complaints. Mr. Bone, surely the increased number of complaints in the last 10 years is evidence enough to suggest that we should question an inspection that declares that there is no cause for concern at all. Surely I should be listened to as a local representative, being there longer than all these other people are concerned, after 31 years' experience. Perhaps it is not, but in 2010, a whistleblower who was a practicing doctor for the service claimed that the previous chief executive for the services would often circulate emails to encourage staff members to talk up the service. Now, this happened. This actually happened when inspectors came to visit. Nothing at all done about the people, from the people who were responsible for governance. In fact, according to them, internal surveys that were meant to help the service improve itself would obviously be often be loaded to ensure that a negative response could not be inputted into the questionnaire. So the service was either excellent, very good, or quite good. And we, the mother of all parliaments, as power has seeped away, have allowed all this to happen. What is the good, Mr. Bone, of electing members of parliament if we have become so impotent, frankly? I recognise the motivation behind what the Air Quality Commission does to ensure that the health service across the country is serving the interests of patients. But I cannot help but feel that the inspectors are missing or being misled by staff at SEPT, who have in the past been reported of ensuring that patients are on their best behaviour when inspection takes place. I think it's important to link this with the statistics that I referred to. The numbers of complaints have increased. How the CQC does not consider this to be not only incredibly concerning for patients and their relatives, but also very suspicious is alarming. I welcome the recent report into Bedford Hospital. I mentioned in the Christmas adjournment debate about the previous chief executive who left in September, Patrick Geoghegan, and his past history. I've mentioned in this debate about the very large salary increase. I haven't got the time, Mr. Bone, to go into how he described himself as a doctor. I have my own view as to what a doctor is. I will leave that to others to reflect on him. But I think it is curious how this chief executive went from the modest role of a hospital porter when I was a member of Parliament for Basildon to become then just about one of the highest chief paid executives in the whole of the country. And the Mother of Parliaments has done absolutely nothing about this disgrace. We've just had head down and a rule of silence, line to take, Minister, and let's just get on with it. But I'm certainly not going to remain silent about it. Mr. Geoghegan, under Labour, for example, received the NHS Leader of the Year award in 2009, beating 700 other candidates. And he was rewarded with a huge pay increase. One of the most consistent complaints that I receive is with regards to the number of locum staff that the service employs. There's evidence to suggest that agency staff often work 2 jobs and as a result will turn up late for shifts. In 2008, an independent inquiry criticised the staff turnaround rate after murder was committed by the schizophrenic Gary Roberts, and there was a report on that. I'm rushing through this because I've got so much to say. Now, John Vesey was the former chairman of SEPT for 6 years, and he has told me that there was a problem getting staff when he was there, and he knew of extra money being offered to prospective psychiatrists on the side. He said that the directors lied through their teeth. Now, this is coming from the former chairman about this, when this was brought up at a board meeting. In 2007, the Trust was still facing staff shortages, and the board discussed this issue, but concluded that the shortages had no detrimental effect on the quality of care. What an absolute... and the Trust went on to... ignore things. In response to a freedom of information request that I put to the Trust in September 2013, I was told that £600,000 was spent on promoting this organisation, which was 3 times the salary that Mr. Geoghegan was receiving at the time, and we could have employed a number of hospital consultants. The use of the public relations techniques are an absolute disgrace. Sharon Tattoo, a constituent, became a whistleblower. And I just very briefly want to talk about the 2 issues. John Vesey, while chairman of the Thameside Mental Health Service, as it was then called, recalled how he was forced to dismiss a member of the board by the regional chairman after he was threatened with dismissal if he did not dismiss this individual from his post. This example of bullying is absolutely typical of SEPT, and the corruption does not end there. There was a particular incident where Mr. Vesey, in response to a large and elaborate party that had been held for his birthday, approached the director responsible for finance and inquired about how the party had been paid for. The response unnerved Mr. Vesey. The money had come from funds donated by what the then finance director called, quote, grateful patients. Sharon Tattoo worked for SEPT. She became aware of what she saw to be the misuse of funds by the leadership. She told Mr. Vesey, the chairman, about the funding being redirected. The chief executive then warned her that if she were to raise these issues with the chairman, his job would be at risk, and she was advised that she would refrain from making further complaints. Mr. Bone, I could go on and on about what happened. Well, Mr. Geoghegan left in September. But what on earth is going on with the board when they replace Mr. Geoghegan by his deputy, Sally Morris, who'd been there since 2005. Now, I've looked at the present board members from where they come from, and now it's a much larger organisation. But what on earth has Lorraine Cable been doing as the chairman of the trust in overseeing all of this? I think it is an absolute disgrace what has been happening. And all the time, my constituents have been suffering as a result of this poor care. For instance, I have a young girl who's now in Rochford Hospital due to having suicidal thoughts, she escaped alongside, this is recently, with another patient from a ward. And the staff apparently allowed this escape to happen. I want to ask how the staff on duty at the time, bearing in mind that these patients have fragile minds, allowed 2 patients to escape from a secure unit. It is absolutely disgraceful what has happened. And in conclusion, Mr. Bone, I want to end by paying tribute to the work of one of my constituents, Cheryl Higgins, who in 1999 recognised how poor the health services were in my constituency, and together supported by John Barber, she set up Trust Links to address the gap in mental health services, and that organisation is still flourishing today. So I want to say to the Minister, I'm not going to let this matter drop. I'm really not. I am very, very angry with the way I have been ignored on this issue. I have no doubt that there will be a line to take, and I will be told all is well. It is not well. This is a very expensive service, and it seems to me that we want a complete clean sweep of the management. And that is what I'm asking the Minister to achieve, because mental health services have always been the Cinderella service. And the government which I support came to power under one of our colleagues who was then a minister, given a pledge that it would no longer be the Cinderella service and it was going to be frontline now. From what is happening in my own area, I am not at all satisfied that this organisation who are running matters is fit for purpose. And I'm not going to shut up, Mr. Bone, until I get some real action on this issue.
Minister.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Bone. It's very clear from my honourable friend's contribution how strongly he feels about this, and I absolutely respect that. And I'm not interested in any line to take from the government. And I have a speech here, but I want to try and address directly what he has had to say. I actually share his passion for trying to improve mental health services. It's something that I personally feel very strongly about. And I don't like the idea of ever sweeping failures of service under the carpet. And he has raised some very serious concerns. He obviously hasn't had time to go into the detail of all of the things that he wanted to raise. And I would be very keen to meet with him to discuss those issues further. I wanted to say a word about what I'm trying to do in mental health, because I agree with him that it has always been the Cinderella service. And there is what I would describe as an institutional bias against mental health within the NHS. And it demonstrates itself in all sorts of ways. The spotlight isn't on mental health in terms of standards, as it is in other areas of the health service. And one of the things that I sought to do and achieved was that when we responded as a government to the Francis report on Mid Staffordshire, that we made very clear that the concerns he raised about culture in the NHS and what had to happen to address those cultural problems were just as important in mental health as in any other part of the health service. And if he reads the government's response to Francis, he will see that that is the case. One of the ways in which we have responded to Francis is to substantially change the way in which the Care Quality Commission goes about its work. He has, in a way, sought to make the case, and putting it that way, I don't in any way suggest that he's wrong to do so. I'm not in a position to judge ultimately, but he sought to make the case that there's a massive gap between what he knows about a local service and what the regulators say about that service. And I'm acutely aware from my own part of the world up in Norfolk that sometimes when one is acutely aware of concerns about our ambulance service, for example, the response you get is that everything's actually fine. We know it's not fine. So we need to try to get to a point where the inspectors, the regulators, reach a clear and accurate view of the quality of services. So the inspection regime that we are introducing, first in acute hospitals, but then very soon applying to mental health trusts as well, is much, much more rigorous than anything that has gone before. One of the things that the previous government did in 2008 was to remove specialist teams of inspectors so that everyone became generalists within the CQC. So you might one week be inspecting a dental practice, then a GP practice, then an acute hospital, and perhaps a mental health trust. This is no good. You have to have people who know what they're looking for. And critically also, you need to involve clinicians from elsewhere and, just as important, service users who may well get an insight or have an insight that others will never be able to achieve. And as a result of those inspections, led by, we've now appointed, or the CQC has now appointed, a Deputy Chief Inspector responsible for mental health. And I would urge my honourable friend to contact him directly and seek to raise his concerns with him, because he will now be in charge of the inspection regime for mental health. And at the end of that inspection process, mental health trusts will be rated so that the public has a much better view of what the quality of a service is actually like in their local area. And inspections, I mean, regulation on its own doesn't change culture. I absolutely get that. You need carrot and stick. You need to do things to change the culture within organisations, as well as seeking to secure good standards by way of regulation. But regulation and inspection is a critical part of the overall picture, and we have to have confidence in that inspection regime. And I think everything that has emerged from the work of the Care Quality Commission under the new leadership of David Behan and David Pryor, a former colleague of my honourable friend, who I happen to beat in North Norfolk, to give him the opportunity of being the chair of the Care Quality Commission, that they understand about compassionate care and about high standards of care. And I think we will shine a spotlight on mental health services and other parts of the health service, which has not happened in the past. And I think that that will be of some value.
Does understand how frustrating it is for me, because I had a very long speech to go through. With all this due diligence and the inspection, how on earth was it allowed that the previous chief executive, who was in I'm not going to enlarge on it, in an unusual relationship, let's put it like that. So someone is installed in a property in my constituency, there's a dispute about that. But then the person that Patrick Egan then became in a relationship with became a top earning member of the board. I mean, this is absolutely crazy what has happened. So I'm just going to need quite a bit of convincing whoever the minister is going to introduce me to, that it seems it's only when you air things publicly in Parliament that there's any interest. Yes, Minister, let's get a brief ready. But if I say to the Minister, I'm not going to let this matter drop because my constituents deserve better than they get at the moment, frankly.
Minister.
Well, I hope he's recognised that I've sought not to just read from a pre-prepared speech and to address his concerns directly. I happen to share his concern about levels of pay within the upper echelons of the NHS as well, and that's something that I think absolutely has to be addressed. But on a more positive note, let me, in the very short time I have available, also just mention to him, because I know he is concerned, genuinely very concerned about the quality of mental health services, some of the positive things that we're doing. So in January we launched a document called Closing the Gap, which is directly addressed at this fact that mental health services always fall behind physical health services. We've stated publicly, we've put it into legislation, that there should be parity of esteem, equality between mental health and physical health services. But this, let me just finish this sentence, this document, Closing the Gap, identifies 25 areas where there is essential change needed in mental health services. For example, just one case, the use of face-down restraint all over the place within mental health services. This is not acceptable in a modern mental health service. It's not necessary. Lots of areas have demonstrated how you can achieve positive regimes without the use of that sort of barbaric approach. I give way.
John Barrow.
Briefly, congratulate my honourable friend for securing this important debate. But can I also suggest to the Minister that going forward, with regards to his deliberations, as he well knows, there are various shades of mental health problems, and care in the community is an important aspect of that care. And day centres up and down the country are under threat. Monday House in my constituency being one of them. Would he also look at what can be done to ensure that we do more to support day centres as a means of not just supporting mental health patients, but other patients and community members generally?
Well, I'm conscious I'm very close to running out of time, but there are often very, very good community services which do enormously good work in their local areas. And the whole focus on mental health needs to be moving towards much more of a prevention approach, early intervention, rather than allowing the problem to deteriorate and then act only after it has happened, and also to focus much more on recovery. So much we seek to contain people's ill health rather than seek to help them to recover in a meaningful sense. And I just wanted to finally mention our Crisis Care Concordat, which for the first time will set high standards of crisis care in mental health, which have never existed in the past. And now we will expect every area to implement that Concordat so that people, wherever they are in the country, get access to the right standards of care.
Order, order. I apologise to members because I'm sure this could continue, but the sitting stands adjourned. Order, order.